Nadine Parrish Oneal.
Thank you, Pastor Strong, and thank you for this opportunity. And to Pastor Strong, to the officers and members of Historic Brown Chapel, it's my pleasure to bring the story today of Historic Brown Chapel. But I thought about how to do this presentation. It's a little different from presenting to visitors who come to the city, because they know nothing when they come about who Brown Chapel is, what Brown Chapel is. But I want to back up just a little bit, because there would not be a Brown Chapel were it not for African Methodism.
That is true.
Our church was founded on the need for not just religious freedom, but also for social justice.
You're right.
Our church was founded to be a beacon to those who were still enslaved and to those who were fortunate enough to have become freedmen. As a matter of fact, our church was founded by one such freedman and a couple of others. But the one who sticks out in our mind is Richard Allen. And those of you who are AMEs know Richard Allen's story. Richard Allen was blessed. He was also endowed by God to this movement that we now know as African Methodism. But what we need to understand is that when Richard Allen and his followers left St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church, they did not immediately start a church.
Right, right.
They started the Free African Society.
Free African Society.
And what was the Free African Society? The Free African Society was an organization organized to do good and to help those in the city of Philadelphia who needed their help.
You are right.
To the point that when the yellow fever broke out in Philadelphia,
You are right.
sometimes Richard Allen and his followers were the only ones who would go into the homes of those suffering with the yellow fever and cool their scorching brows.
Yeah, yeah. And all we did bodies.
And they did a lot to help people in the city. They provided food.
Yeah.
Well, you want to say, why? How could they have done this? They were, a lot of people were still enslaved. We're talking about 1787.
Yeah.
A lot of us were still enslaved.
Yeah.
But those who were free, who were members of the Free African Society, used what little they had. And it teaches us a lot about community, and when community comes together to become a united community, what can be done.
Yeah.
They did a lot.
Yeah.
So I want to move on to the African Methodist Episcopal Church, when the first church was built on the corner of 6th and Lombard in Philadelphia,
Yeah.
now known as Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. It is our flagship church, just as Brown Chapel is the flagship of the 9th Episcopal District.
You are right.
But Mother Bethel still stands, a beautiful church with beautiful stained glass windows.
Yeah. Yeah.
It still stands as a beacon for the beginnings of African Methodism in the United States and abroad. We want to be sure to understand that our church is not just within the continental United States. We have churches throughout the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we finally got the message and elected bishops of African descent so that they could serve in their homeland. But also, I'm wondering what's keeping them from serving
Uh-oh.
the continental United States.
Well.
If we are to be true to the calling of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, social justice and religious freedom.
Yeah.
But that social justice tells us
Yeah.
that we cannot just limit our brothers who are bishops of African descent just to the continent of Africa.
My.
We also have churches in the Caribbean. So this church is a powerful church. And I was watching, I don't know how many of you pay attention. I sometimes when I'm watching a movie, especially if it's an African American movie, I'll pay attention to the small things. Things that other people might not catch. And I was watching a movie yesterday afternoon. I can't even remember the name of it because it was one of those kind of fluff-like movies, one put together by African Americans, and it didn't have much of a point. But what they did have and made reference to was that the family needed a church. And in that movie, the church they found was the African Methodist Episcopal Church in that city. In a lot of movies, when you see a church, they're AME churches, a lot of times. Very seldom are they churches of other denominations. But we move forward to, from 1816, when the first AME church was built. Let's move forward a little bit. After the Civil War.
Yeah.
Now, I was born July the 8th, 1948,
My.
right here in Selma, Alabama. And during my childhood, I grew up maybe playing in the front yard at night, early evening, catching lightning bugs, playing hide and seek. When all of a sudden we would hear horns blowing, and they would be afar off. Everybody was ushered into the house because we knew when we heard those horns blowing that the Klan was getting ready to ride through our neighborhoods. I was born during the Jim Crow South, here in the Deep South. I was living under Jim Crow laws. When those horns would blow, the men in our neighborhood would hurriedly go from house to house to make sure the women and children were inside. They would then shoot out the street lights and sit on their porches with their shotguns across their laps. And you know, they say we were a fearful people. We were not a fearful people. The people in my neighborhood and the men in my neighborhood did what they had to do.
Yeah.
They were real men.
Yeah.
And although they did not stand in the street to look in the cars, they were prepared for whatever might happen. But those who were fearful were those riding in the cars with their faces covered. The Klan. Those were the cowards. Number one, they couldn't show their faces. Number two, they never got out. They just rode through the neighborhood as an intimidation tactic. Jim Crow South was not easy to live in. I grew up in a time when my grandmother lived with us, and every Saturday morning she would take my sister and me downtown to the Five and Dime. And all the way down she would say, keep your hands to yourself. Keep your hands to yourself. Because a little inquisitive black child would have the police called if you touch something. And you know how little children are. They don't want to steal it. They just want to know how it feels. What is this? Let me touch it. Let me see what this is. What does it feel like if I touch it?
Natural childhood.
Well, as a child, I couldn't touch in the Five and Dime, and I understood that. We lived, although we lived during the Jim Crow South, and a lot of Northerners mistake being from the Deep South to being something less than. But I want to serve notice that although I was in the Jim Crow South, I had the best childhood in the world.
Amen.
I lived in the best community in the world. I went to the best church in the world.
All right, what church?
Brown Chapel AME Church nurtured me. It was my social outlet because the movie theater was segregated. The lunch counters were segregated. So what could you do?
Church.
My mother said, before you will stand to the back window of Thirsty Boy, you won't eat a hamburger downtown. I'll make the hamburgers at home. Before you'll sit in the balcony of a movie theater, you won't go to the movie theater. Just go down to the church or the YPD meeting, the Allen Christian Endeavor Fellowship meeting. Those were our social outlets. And we learned a lot from participating in those activities. So, Brown Chapel, that now stands as a beacon to the world. Brown Chapel, that is being renovated, and we hope to the glory of God. Brown Chapel has some very, very astute ministers. I think I mentioned in Sunday school the last time you were here, Mr. Wahid, that in 1936, 37, there was a preacher here by the name of Reverend Hughes. Reverend Hughes had been preaching, voting, and fair wages for African Americans. Reverend Hughes was not liked by the white establishment. So one day when he was out visiting the sick, the Klan went to the parsonage, Brown Chapel's parsonage. Mrs. Hughes was there alone. They asked about Reverend Hughes, and she said, well, I don't know where he is. He's out visiting the sick, and I can't pinpoint where he is at this time. They left and said they would be back. Now, how did she know that they were coming? Community. There was a maid in the home of one of the white folk who got word to Mrs. Hughes that the Klan was coming for Reverend Hughes. Community. How we took care of each other. Right. How we got word to each other to look out, danger is on the way. When Reverend Hughes came home, he went out the back door of the parsonage, and those of you who are old, Mrs. Hedden, I know you remember the old parsonage was 2 stories. It wasn't the little house that you see there now. The parsonage at that time was a beautiful 2-story parsonage made out of the same brick as the church. It was a beautiful structure. He went out of the back door of the parsonage into the church, and he went up into that same bell tower that's now being restored. And he hid. He hid until it was safe. The way he came out of the church was Mr. Moss, Edwin Moss's father. And you all know Edwin Moss, who had the credit union, was over the credit union here. It was his father who had his sons with him. They came and they got Reverend Hughes, and they took him out of the country. I don't know how they got word to my grandfather and his brothers, but my grandfather had about 5 brothers. They met the Moss family and took Reverend Hughes from the Moss family, took him further out in the rural, and put him on a train. This incident is chronicled in Amelia Boynton Billups Robinson's book, Bridge Over Jordan. She talks about Reverend Hughes and this incident with Reverend Hughes. Unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about what happened to Reverend Hughes. We don't know what happened to Mrs. Hughes. I talked with a few people, and I understand that the records at Daniel Payne were destroyed by a hurricane some years ago. And there's no record of whether Reverend Hughes continued as an AME minister when he got to the north. Now, Reverend Hughes played a large part in Brown Chapel's history. And it is an important part because it lets us know that nothing is new under the sun. That we repeat things. We're back to talking about fair wages. We're back to talking about voting. And we were leading up to 1965. The history of Brown Chapel includes a strong history in the training of her youth. Margaret Jones Moore was the YPD director for many years.
All right.
And I think Pastor Strong was more than 8. You know, we're limited to 8. But sometimes you can get somebody so good, nobody would challenge them. Nobody challenged her. When we talk about faith, family, friends, and community, there were people in GWC homes who were not members of the church, but their children came for YPD. Their children sang in the youth choir. Their children came to Allen Christian Endeavor Fellowship. Their children were integral parts of Brown Chapel's church life. Because those YPD directors and those who worked with the young folk reached out and brought those children in. Now, it did not hinder that Mrs. Moore was a teacher at R.B. Hudson High School, and she had a lot of influence over a lot of those students who also lived in GWC homes, and she would encourage them to come to the church. We go now quickly to the voting rights movement. I know Mr. Wahid is on to speak as well. But we know the key players. Bishop I.H. Bond
Take your time.
was the bishop of the 9th Episcopal District at the time. And you hear some controversy surrounding what was happening at the church. And I've heard people say, well, Brown Chapel members were afraid. Brown Chapel's members were no different than any members in any of the other churches. And I can stand here and call them. Tabernacle, First Baptist, Second Baptist, Mount Airy, Ward Chapel, all of them. Everybody had some trepidation about getting in the fight. We were fortunate enough to have Reverend P.H. Lewis. And if anybody knew him, he stood tall, and I'm going to use his term, and it's not a negative term. He stood tall and black for what was right and what needed to be done.
That's right.
We talked about Reverend Hughes, and I forgot to mention that the Klan came for Reverend Hughes, but in 1965, Reverend Lewis was in jail,
That's right.
and the Klan came for him. They burned a cross in front of the parsonage while Reverend Lewis was in jail. Mrs. Lewis was there with those 2 little boys, Kenneth and Prentice Lewis. They were very young. I remember my mother got a phone call, and she was hurriedly getting on her clothes and her shoes, and my grandmother said, well, where are you going this time of night? And she said, well, I just got a call, a cross is burning in front of the church, and Mrs. Lewis and those little boys are there by themselves. She got in her car, and we were afraid for her. But she got in her car, and she went down to the church. By the time she got there, some of the men of the church had come as well. They were okay because the Klan had not gone in the house. They just burned the cross. But from 1936 or 37 to 1965, we were fighting the same battles. And I want to stick a pin right here and let you know that the battle is not over.
That's right.
We are still fighting those same battles.
Struggle continues.
You listen to the news, and what do you hear?
That's right.
You hear a man who wants to be president again. And what is he saying? I will be a real dictator if I get back in there. Those words came from his mouth. And what he's saying is, you ain't seen nothing yet. Just watch when I get back in there.
Well.
So what does that tell us? We need to vote, and we need to encourage others to vote. We had people in Brown Chapel who stood tall. It wasn't just Reverend Lewis. Jean Jackson hosted Martin Luther King at her home when he came. Margaret Moore's home became known as the Freedom House. When SNCC came to Selma, Bernard Lafayette lived with her. To the consternation of her mother, Mrs. Hattie Hudson, who was the head stewardess at Brown Chapel, who said, you're not going to let that man live in your house and you have young daughters there and you don't know anything about it. But Margaret Moore said, he will live here. So Bernard Lafayette and his wife did live in Margaret Moore's house.
All right.
During the movement. Brown Chapel's history of community.
Lord have mercy.
Brown Chapel has been on this fight for a long time.
Yeah.
And I hope that we won't stop
Yeah.
at just restoring the building.
Yeah.
That we will restore the people in the church.
You are right.
To know that
Sister, you are
this
right.
church is
You are
not
right.
just some little church.
You are right.
To know that the African Methodist Episcopal Church is not just some little church. Even with all our issues, with all our faults, with all that's going on in the AME church today, we are still a powerhouse.
All right.
And we need to pray every day to God to keep us strong.
Yes.
In 1965, students were leaving R.B. Hudson High School to go to First Baptist. First Baptist was known as the Freedom Church, to be trained by SNCC. My sister and I continued to go to school every day because my mother taught at the high school, 7th grade social studies. But one morning she said to us, I know you all want to participate in the movement, so just go on down to the church and participate. Do you remember the term jumping up and down happy? When you were a little child, did anything ever happen in your life that made you jumping up and down happy? Well, you were just so happy you couldn't contain yourself. Well, that morning when she told us to go down to the church to participate, we were jumping up and down happy. And that began our role in the voting rights movement. Instead of going to school, we would get up and get dressed and go to either First Baptist or Brown Chapel. In order to get to the church, we had to walk through throngs of white men on horseback with all kinds of weapons. They were standing on the corner of Jeff Davis and J.L. Chestnut, what is now J.L. Chestnut and Martin Luther King. At that time, it was Sylvan Street and Jeff Davis. They were standing there right at the railroad. And as we walked through, they would say all kinds of ugly things, especially to the young ladies. But one of the lessons we had been taught by SNCC was to not engage them, but stay focused on getting to the church. Then when we got to the church, we were trained in the art of protesting. You say trained, and in the art of marching. Well, how are you trained in the art of marching? You just put one foot in front of the other. In 1965, it was more than that.
That's right.
It was also staying alive.
That's right.
How you had to get down on the ground in a crouching position with your hands over your head. Because we were told that it was better to have a blow to the arm or the wrist than a blow to the head.
All right.
These were perilous times.
Yeah.
We were taught nonviolence and the necessity to remain nonviolent so that the movement could continue. So we went. My sister spent a night in jail. The night she was arrested, all of the jails were full. So they were taken to the National Guard Armory that's over there on Washington Street, the old National Guard Armory. It's now a place where a lot of tourists want to ride by. When she got out the next morning, and I'll never forget this scene, she came to the house early that morning before my mother left for work. She fell on the floor and she cried. She didn't stay on the floor for 2 weeks, but she literally cried for 2 weeks because of the treatment in that National Guard Army. They were made to stand on tiptoe, take 2 fingers and push the walls down all night while the deputies came along with a cattle prod and stuck the girls with the cattle prod and hit the boys with the billy club. The only thing that saved Phyllis from the cattle prod was Charles Malden, who was the leader of the student movement, put his body over hers to protect her from that sting. What we saw and what we witnessed in 1965. The mass meetings were jubilant affairs. We enjoyed going to mass meetings. We didn't know who was going to speak, but whoever it was, we wanted to hear them. We never missed a mass meeting, especially if Dr. King was going to speak. But anyway, we didn't miss. And then my mother was a participant in the Teachers March. There was also a Ministers March, community, different facets of the community coming together to support the movement for voting rights.
All right.
Community coming together.
Yeah.
Community
Community.
coming together.
Yeah.
We cannot separate
You're right about
the
that.
church from community.
You are right. You are so right.
And we need to always remember those in Brown Chapel who sometimes almost gave their lives for this voting rights movement. The 2 of the teachers at R.B. Hudson, Margaret Moore and my mother Lula Parrish, were called into the principal's office and accused of encouraging students to leave school. At that point, they were both the breadwinners in their families, so they denied it, but went right back to their classrooms and encouraged students to leave, to go to the church. They could have been fired, but they took the chance. There's a picture out there of teachers meeting at R.B. Hudson High School, and I wish you could see that picture. I'm going to have it blown up, because on that picture are many of Brown Chapel's members who were teachers at R.B. Hudson High School, who were in that meeting, and not just to the back of the room. They were up front. Margaret Moore and Lula Parrish was sitting at the front table. Robert Perry was standing in the aisle because the seats were filled. That cafeteria was not that large. Community. We have come this far by faith.
Yeah.
It is faith that saw us through everything that went on in 1965. You all know Brown Chapel was the site of the 3 major marches: Bloody Sunday, Turnaround Tuesday, and the Successful March. And I can give you the dates. March the 7th, Bloody Sunday. March the 9th, Turnaround Tuesday. March 21st, the beginning of the Successful March from Selma to Montgomery. I know I've talked a while because I have a passion for this story,
Take your time.
and I have a passion for where Brown Chapel stands, not just in this story,
Yeah.
but in America.
That's
Yeah.
right.
I wish you could see the people that I see that come, that want to hear your story.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
yeah.
wish you could see the children that come and want to hear your story. I had a group on Friday from a Jesuit school in Indianapolis. These were all black kids, but they were wonderful. They listened attentively to the story and then had wonderful questions to ask about what Brown Chapel did during that time. Let us restore to faith,
Yeah, yeah. Now, that's
to
it.
family,
That's it.
Right.
That's
to
it.
friends,
That's
to
it
community.
right there. That's it.
Brown Chapel, African Methodist Episcopal
That's it
Church.
right there.
And I hear some people say they don't like the makeup, and some of our members,
Yeah.
they don't like the hierarchy of the AME
Yeah,
church.
it is what it is.
It's the hierarchy. It's what makes the AME church. It was by design
Yeah.
that we are African Methodists. So as we move forward from celebrating this day, let us never forget our history. Let us be proud of our history.
That's right.
But there were people who laid their lives down. They laid their livelihoods down for the cause of freedom. But the important thing today is how important the vote is. And let us not sit down on voting. Yes, vote for the dog catcher. Because even if you put your little dog down there, you voted for somebody who doesn't believe in dogs and doesn't like dogs, the dog catcher may pick up your little dog
That's right.
and take it on somewhere.
That's
And
right.
I'm saying that to say, every election is important. Faith, family, friends,
Look.
and community,
Amen.
all important to
Amen.
who we are today.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.